Let's stick with Richard Sharp, long-standing Conservative donor. Revelations in the Sunday Times yesterday, extraordinary story this. He helped to arrange an £800,000 loan guarantee for Boris Johnson, only weeks before the Prime Minister recommended him for the role of the chairman of the BBC. Richard Sharp has denied any conflict of interest, and the government has insisted that all proper processes were followed. Let's speak to the Labour MP, Kevin Brennan, who is a member of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, which held a pre-appointment hearing with the chairman before he was confirmed to the job in 2021. Morning, Kevin.
Good morning.
The Cabinet Office says he was chosen by a rigorous appointments process. But ultimately, this job is just in the gift of the government, isn't it?
Yes, and so political involvement is not doesn't preclude you from applying for the job, but you are expected to follow the principles of public life and also to be fully, frank in disclosing when you're being interviewed. Now, he appeared before our select committee and made no mention whatsoever of this loan that he was helping to facilitate for the Prime Minister. Extraordinarily, the Prime Minister needed to scrape up £800,000 in order to support his dissolute lifestyle. And Richard Sharp was involved in sort of brokering that. And when he appeared before our committee, however, he made no mention of that whatsoever, despite the fact that he's required, under those principles, to make sure that he has personal independence. That's the phrase that's used, personal independence from government ministers. It really is a pretty shocking state of affairs.
Your committee, the committee you sit on, the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, approved his appointment after holding the hearing with him. If you'd have known this at the time, do you think the committee would have taken a different view on approving his appointment?
I can't speak for the committee on that score, but I think anybody could see who's fair-minded that it was something relevant that should have been disclosed. And the questioning from the committee, was about his competence. And he's a very able individual, a very successful business person, perhaps not directly connected with broadcasting before, but that doesn't preclude him from applying for the job. But he made out as if, look, I wasn't asked to do this by ministers. The Prime Minister or the Culture Secretary didn't ask me to apply. I applied because of my friends at the BBC thought I ought to apply for the job. I was just a punter who filled in a form, did an interview and got appointed to the job. We now know that at the same time all that was going on, he was having meetings with the Prime Minister and a friend and a distant relative of the Prime Minister in order to try and scrape up 800 grand, for the Prime Minister. Now, if that isn't a relevant thing to declare to the committee, so the committee can decide whether it thinks that, that's a difficulty in this appointment, then I don't know what is, and why on earth he didn't tell us that. I understand actually from reports this morning that the Culture Secretary didn't even know about it, and he was responsible for the appointment. If it wasn't a relevant factor that the Culture Secretary ought to have known it, or the interview panel, then I don't know what is.
Do you think the process should now be reopened? I mean, can it be reopened? Do you go as far as saying that Richard Sharp should consider stepping back from this role?
Well, we don't have any power to block his appointment, or in fact to sack him as BBC chair. But I think he has questions to answer, and I think the government has questions to answer, because obviously Richard Sharp, as well as clearly being someone who was brokering a loan for the Prime Minister, is also someone who's very close to the current Prime Minister. Who he used to be his boss actually when he was working in the banking industry. So there are questions to be asked as to whether there's been full and appropriate disclosure in this case. Now, our committee will be meeting shortly. I'm sure this is something that we'll discuss as to what we think ought to happen next. But in my view, I think it's very difficult for him to explain why he didn't disclose this information at the time. As you say, it's an extraordinary story, and why he would have thought that wasn't relevant when he was supposed to be guaranteeing to us his personal independence from government ministers baffles me, frankly.
And what do you, just finally, the impact, I mean, clearly there were questions to answer on the specific of Richard Sharp, but the impact that this has on the BBC, in terms of the public perception of it. I mean, Richard Sharp came in, I think in the first interview he gave, he talked about how he wanted to redress the balance and no more lefty woke hand-wringing, my words rather than his. And he wanted to sort of tip the balance, if you like, at the BBC. To now understand that he was so close to the then Prime Minister who gave him the job that he was helping broker a loan like this, it undermines faith in the independence of the BBC, doesn't it?
Of course, the context of his appointment was that some people were quite relieved because previously there'd been talk of appointing Charles Moore or Paul Dacre, who, were very, very partial right-wing, newspaper editors and columnists, to that role. So there was a sort of almost a bit of relief when Richard Sharp came before the committee and said, well, he thought that the BBC's news coverage was impartial. That's what he told us when he appeared before us, but that he thought that impartiality had been questioned by others and that therefore it was important that the BBC could be shown to be impartial in all of its news editing. So, the irony is, in a sense, that he came in, selling that message, and we now found out that actually he was so close to Boris Johnson that he was actually trying to organise a loan for him in the background whilst he was applying for the job. And that does seriously call into question the whole way that this appointment was made.
Good to speak to you this morning. Labour MP Kevin Brennan, member of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Just while we were speaking, actually, we've just had some breaking news in that the BBC is reporting that the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, says he wants to ensure all the appropriate guidelines have been followed and has asked the nominations committee of the BBC board to review any potential conflicts of interest amid claims he helped Boris Johnson secure a loan. So that's just being reported now. The BBC saying that Richard Sharp said he wants to ensure all the appropriate guidelines have been followed and has now asked the BBC nominations committee, the BBC board's nominations committee, to review any potential conflicts of interest. We'll keep across that for you this morning.